Within his 2009 text, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, Sir Ian McGilchrist, the British psychiatrist, philosopher, and neuroscientist, delves into the far-reaching implications of the hemispheric lateralization which we find within the human brain. As many are well aware, the human brain is lateralized between left and right hemispheres. Since the dawn of neuroscience during the 20th century, it has been commonly understood that these two hemispheres contain different neurological organs which are responsible for rather different tasks. Within popular culture, it is very often presumed that the right hemisphere is more creative, holistic, and intuitive, while the left hemisphere is much more logical, mathematical, and procedural. As we will see, this pop culture interpretation isn't exactly incorrect, but it glosses over a vastly more complex story which is absolutely central to the story of consciousness evolution, which we have explored over the course of the past 5 videos. According to Ian McGilchrist, the two cerebral hemispheres represent two distinct ways of attending to the world. To use Heideggerian language, we could say that the left and right hemispheres represent two distinct forms of attunement to reality. McGilchrist argues that the left hemisphere is primarily oriented towards a very narrow perspective, within which different parts of the world can be isolated, scrutinized, and manipulated. The right hemisphere, conversely, adopts a much broader, more holistic perspective on the world. All things are seen as living participants within an organic whole, which is inextricably dynamic and relational. In many ways, McGilchrist's understanding of hemispheric lateralization mirrors the phenomenology which we find in the works of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger likewise distinguishes between two distinct modes of attending to the world, Vorhandenheit and Zuhandenheit. Vorhandenheit could be translated as something like being as presence. It is a mode of awareness within which particular entities are isolated from the world which they are a part of, such that the entity can be scrutinized in abstraction. Zuhandenheit, conversely, can be understood as something like being as involvement. Zuhandenheit perceives entities as they actually exist within embodied, relational, living processes. When a carpenter is using a hammer on a daily basis for his regular work, he perceives the hammer as Zuhandenheit. The hammer almost dissolves into the surrounding life world. It becomes transparent, as it were, and ceases to be seen as a distinct entity at all. If, however, the hammer breaks or is unable to perform a certain task, then the carpenter might instead perceive the hammer through Vorhandenheit. The hammer then pops out of the surrounding life world and becomes a seemingly independent object of scrutiny as the carpenter attempts to identify the problem and solve it. What we should notice here is that, in reality, the hammer is not in fact truly separate from the life world which it is a part of. When Vorhandenheit separates the hammer from its context so as to perceive it as a discrete object, this is in effect a process of abstraction. In a sense, the hammer we perceive is no longer the real hammer, but rather a purely conceptual image of the hammer, which can allow us to address the hammer as an isolated problem to be solved. McGilchrist's understanding of hemispheric lateralization is very similar in that we can see the right hemisphere as corresponding to the mode of Zuhandenheit, while the left hemisphere would correspond to the mode of Vorhandenheit. According to McGilchrist, the right hemisphere mode of perception is much more foundational than the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere perceives the world in terms of meaning, values, narratives, and immanent, holistic relationships. The left hemisphere, conversely, is far more practically oriented, but is, on its own, far more narrow and myopic. The right hemisphere is therefore the master, and the left hemisphere is his emissary. McGilchrist therefore comes to understand the malaise of modernity as a result of a historic trajectory towards increasing left hemisphere dominance. The emissary has become more powerful than the master, as it were, and McGilchrist sees this inversion as the root cause which underlies many of the problems we see in modern thinking and modern societies. The reductionistic and mechanistic dogmas of scientific physicalism, the increasing atomization of individual human beings, the breakdown of organic communities, and even our propensities towards chronic anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and autism can all be seen as resulting from an imbalance which privileges the left hemisphere over the right hemisphere. Since the European Enlightenment, the left hemisphere has become increasingly dominant, thus resulting in excessive abstraction, bureaucratic and mechanistic thinking, and a view of nature within which all things are seen as resources to be extracted, regimented, and procedurally managed, a process which Martin Heidegger would refer to as inframing. McGilchrist's narrative is certainly very compelling, but in this video I will ultimately be arguing that his story is in many ways incomplete. However, by attempting to develop a more precise understanding of hemispheric lateralization, we will also begin to unfold the next chapter of the story which we have told thus far, the story of human ego evolution. This video began with what might initially seem to be a very simple question which I was asked by a friend. Do you believe that the left hemisphere is masculine and that the right hemisphere is feminine? Many might see this as a rather meaningless question. One might presume that such a question is equivalent to asking whether kidneys are masculine and livers are feminine. However, I've come to see that this question is not only meaningful, but in fact absolutely crucial. Moreover, I've come to see that the answer to this question is far less obvious than might initially appear to be the case. Within modern culture, we tend to associate both the left hemisphere and masculinity with highly procedural, abstract, mechanistic thinking. Conversely, we tend to associate the creativity, holism, and relational thinking of the right hemisphere with femininity. As such, it is very often suggested that men tend to be more left hemisphere dominant, while women tend to be more right hemisphere dominant. However, when we look more closely at these associations, we actually find that these ways of conceptualizing masculinity and femininity are far from universal and are, in fact, very recent historical developments. For most of human history, in fact, the right hemisphere characteristics of imaginative, holistic, and creative thought were generally considered to be masculine characteristics rather than feminine. For most of human history, the masculine archetype was understood to be oriented towards the free-flowing, creative, and exploratory impulses. The feminine, conversely, was regarded as much more grounded within embodied, practical life processes. If we look to a traditional culture form such as the Christian communities of the early American colonies of New England, we find a very striking polarity. Reading theological works and conversing about theological issues was considered to be a purview of men. Women, on the other hand, tended to be far more concerned with the way in which these theological notions could actually be embodied and lived within immanent reality. Throughout the ancient, medieval, and even Romantic periods, creative pursuits such as poetry, now often considered to be feminine, were regarded as definitively masculine pursuits. Conversely, the routine, procedural activities of embodied day-to-day labor were regarded as primarily feminine. From our modern perspective, this might seem almost backwards, but in reality, our modern gender attributions are strikingly novel. In truth, it wasn't until the Victorian period that we began to see procedural, narrowly focused, and practical activity as masculine characteristics, and to see poetry, creativity, and imagination as feminine attributes. It was during the late 19th and early 20th centuries that industrial capitalism came to completely reshape human social relations and gender roles. Unlike in previous agrarian and pastoral modes of life, industrial capitalism created a world in which working men were either professionals within bureaucratic hierarchies or factory workers. In either case, men were now expected to think and behave in ways that were far more left hemisphere dominant than had been the case for all previous generations. Being the patriarch of a family of farmers or herders required far more holistic thinking, while being a lawyer, manager, or machinist required far more reductionistic and mechanistic ways of attending to the world. Ultimately, the duality of left and right hemispheres is, I would argue, a duality of ideation and embodiment. The right hemisphere perceives the world in terms of meanings, of narratives, of relational wholes. Its guiding principle is that of unity, and as we have already seen in previous videos, the principle of unity is the condition for the possibility of all form. All forms are unifications of multiplicity, and as such, the principle of unity itself is a kind of metaform. It is this form of formedness, as it were, which ancient and medieval metaphysics would correlate with the archetype of the father. This metaform is the principle of divine masculinity, the monad which informs the formlessness of the divine feminine, impregnating the Great Mother so as to give shape to reality. Embodiment, conversely, is associated with femininity. All human bodies are gestated within the body of the mother. Ancient tradition saw red ochre as the menstrual blood of the earth itself, which was used to generate living bodies. The Sumerians saw oceanic salt water as likewise a kind of menstrual blood, which was the raw material of embodied existence. While the masculine was associated with the conceptual, manifestation was a process through which the conceptual was able to realize itself through molding the raw potentiality of the feminine. In a sense, embodiment itself is a process of separation. It is through physiological birth that the infant comes to fission apart from the mother. Likewise, we saw in the previous video how the emergence of human subjectivity was in fact a kind of contraction of cosmic subjectivity into discrete, particular human organisms. The duality of wholeness and narrowness, which we see in the right and left hemispheres, can thus be understood as a duality of universality and particularity, as well as a duality of ideation and embodiment. As such, I believe that Ian McGilchrist actually mischaracterizes hemispheric lateralization in some crucial ways. Within The Master and His Emissary, McGilchrist argues that the right hemisphere is more oriented towards concrete, tangible experiences, while the left brain is more oriented towards abstract ideas. Although I believe that this conclusion is fundamentally incorrect, it is in many ways quite understandable. When we look to the modern world, we see that the left hemisphere tends to be occupied by mathematical models, computational thinking, formal logic, and a fundamentally calculative attitude towards society and human relationships. However, I would argue that these tendencies of the left hemisphere are actually very recent historical developments, and in order to properly contextualize these developments, we need to rewind our story a bit and return to the narrative which we find within the bicameral mind theory of Julian Jaynes. As we saw in more detail previously, Jaynes' conjecture is essentially that prior to the late Bronze Age, human beings did not experience the inner dialogues within their own minds as actually being produced by the human ego. We did not experience our inner voices to be our own voices, but rather we experienced them as the voices of the ancestors or of the gods. During the Bronze Age, however, we see a gradual process by which human beings begin to internalize this mental dialogue such that it comes to be experienced as something which the human ego is actively doing rather than something that is simply happening to us. Over the course of this series of videos, we have seen this process play out repeatedly. The journey of human consciousness evolution in general has been a process by which successive layers of the human compositional makeup have come to be internalized into the human ego, and thereby brought into the manifold of the ego's individual agency. The story of the bicameral mind is particularly significant within this broader narrative, as this story correlates to the development of the discursive structure of consciousness, which we examined in more detail in Part 2. We can illustrate this process of discursive internalization very clearly by looking once again to the world of ancient Greece. The discursive structure of consciousness came to emerge from the mythical structure which had remained dominant since the age of ancient Sumeria. It is within the mythical structure that we find the polarization of the human ego into two distinct aspects. Jean Gebser refers to these as the death soul and life soul, and I have referred to these two poles as the stellar soul and lunar soul. The dynamic between these two aspects of the mythical ego are illustrated very clearly within the tragedy of the Oresteia, written by Aeschylus during the 5th century BC. As we examined in part 2 of this series, the Oresteia can be understood as a sort of blood feud between the spirits of Apollo and Artemis, the twin siblings of the sun and moon, respectively. The story of the Oresteia begins just prior to the events of the Trojan War. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, wishes to set sail to fight in the coming war, but he is prevented from doing so by a great storm, which is said to have occurred because the goddess Artemis is angry with him. In order to end the storm, which prevents his departure, Agamemnon chooses to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, to the gods. Through this act of human sacrifice, the storm does indeed subside, and Agamemnon is able to set sail. Upon his return to Mycenae, however, Agamemnon begins to fall into a trap which has been carefully prepared by his own wife, Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra wishes to avenge her daughter's death, and her plan to murder Agamemnon begins as she greets his return with sacred scarlet tapestries, which she has laid out for him to walk upon as he re-enters his palace. Agamemnon is initially hesitant as he knows that walking upon these tapestries is a sacrilegious act of pride and insult to the gods. Yet Clytemnestra then shows that she understands Agamemnon and the stellar soul much better than Agamemnon himself does. Clytemnestra knows that Agamemnon defines himself in contrast to his rival Priam, the king of Troy. She asks Agamemnon if Priam would be concerned with what his people thought of him, if Priam would restrain his own hubris in such a way. Clytemnestra is essentially asking Agamemnon, if Priam doesn't need to resist his own pride, then why should you have to? Agamemnon takes the bait and walks upon the scarlet tapestries. Clytemnestra's tactic is successful because she knows that Agamemnon's resentment towards Priam is in fact a projection of his own self-repression. She understands that Agamemnon is very much filled with pride and hubris, and that he resents that he must suppress his own instincts in order to live up to the ideal he is expected to embody. The stellar soul is ultimately an idealized self-concept, what Freud would call the ego ideal, and in this scene we can see the very intimate relationship between this ego ideal and the shadow which it casts. Clytemnestra will later go on to murder Agamemnon while he is bathing, using a cloth to strangle him and a knife to stab him to death. In this scene, what we find is an inversion of the slaying of the goddess Tiamat by Marduk within the Sumerian Enuma Elish. Tiamat is the great mother goddess of the ocean, and Marduk is a Jovian culture hero, much akin to Zeus or Thor. Marduk kills Tiamat by trapping her with a fishing net, representing the lattice of the heavens and the power of order to restrain and subdue chaos, and then by stabbing her with a spear, a phallic symbol. Just as Marduk's net represents the lattice-like order of the heavens and the power to subdue the oceanic feminine chaos beneath us, Clytemnestra's cloth represents the lunar Artemis. As we have already begun to see in the scarlet tapestries mentioned previously, cloth is a recurring theme within the Oresteia, which signifies the influence of Artemis. The weaving of cloth was considered a central aspect of women's life in the ancient world, and the interweaving of cloth represented the cultural role of women in maintaining the practices which bound communities and cultures together. Later on in the story, we will see the significance of cloth yet again as Agamemnon's children, Electra and Orestes, encounter one another at Agamemnon's tomb. The two siblings had been separated for much of their lives and initially were not able to recognize one another. But in this interaction, Orestes produces a piece of woven fabric which Electra immediately recognizes. She herself had woven this fabric for Orestes many years ago when he was a child. Through this recognition, Electra sees without doubt that the man she is speaking with is indeed her brother Orestes. In the modern world, our textiles are created through procedural, industrial processes, but in the ancient world, cloth was woven by hand, and each piece of fabric could almost be regarded as a fingerprint of the person who created it. In Electra's recognition of Orestes, we therefore once again see the significance of cloth as symbolizing the way in which the lunar principle of the feminine sentient body is able to facilitate the interweaving of familial and communal relationships. The plot of the Oresteia then comes to center upon Orestes' plot to achieve revenge by murdering his own mother, Clytemnestra. Orestes is commanded to seek vengeance for his father's murder by, of course, the solar god Apollo. I won't be breaking down the subsequent plot points in detail, but here I primarily want to focus upon the ultimate climax of this narrative. Orestes does ultimately succeed in murdering Clytemnestra, but from that point onward, the plot only further devolves into a chaotic maelstrom of guilt, vengeance, and injustice. Orestes comes to be hounded by spirits known as the Furies, which represent ancient, abyssal forces of primal rage and anguish. The narrative finally reaches its climactic resolution in Athens, where the goddess Athena holds a trial to decide the fate of Orestes. The jury casts its judgment, but the vote is tied. Athena then steps in and casts the deciding vote, freeing Orestes and transforming the Furies into the Eumenides, the gracious ones. Athena here represents the principles of prudence, justice, discernment, and pragmatic rumination. She represents a matriarchal power which stands above the stellar and lunar souls of the human sentient body or mythical structure of consciousness, and her power is one which is able to balance and harmonize the conflicts which emerge from within these deeper layers of the human organism. Within the Oresteia, this principle of practical discernment is explicitly shown to be the highest principle of classical Hellenistic consciousness. But moreover, we can also see within the Hellenic world that this principle of matriarchal discernment is being internalized. It is being incorporated into the individual, conscious agency of the developing human ego. Within the Iliad and the Odyssey, we see a very significant shift in the central role performed by the goddess Athena. Within the Iliad, Athena is seen to govern the domain of public, martial order. Here, Athena is depicted as a goddess of war, but more precisely, Athena is seen to represent the self-discipline and self-restraint which separate civilized warfare from primal barbarism. In one crucial scene, Achilles becomes enraged and begins to draw his sword to slay Agamemnon, but Athena intervenes to prevent him from doing so. Within the Iliad, Athena is seen to operate at a transpersonal level, and is seen to act upon the characters from without. Within the Odyssey, however, we begin to see something very different. The Odyssey is a much more personal narrative of Odysseus himself, and we see that Odysseus and Athena share a very personal bond with one another, with Athena serving as a sort of personal mentor figure. Athena praises Odysseus as resourceful and cunning, and Odysseus proclaims that Athena is the only god who truly understands him. Throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus is able to survive his various trials and tribulations precisely through the sort of pragmatic wit, self-discipline, and rational discernment which are emblematic of Athena. The Athenian principle is not simply acting upon Odysseus from without, but rather his personal connection to Athena is precisely because he has come to internalize this Athenian principle into his own ego, his own personal agency. Within the Socratic dialogues, we see the same story unfold in a different manner. Socrates travels about ancient Athens, teaching the Athenians that they are able to discern truth for themselves, and that the first step towards such discernment is dialogue. Recall that it is within the left cerebral hemisphere that we find Broca's and Wernicke's regions, which are responsible for language production and language comprehension. Julian Jaynes saw that our inner voices didn't become an inner monologue until the late Bronze Age, because it was during this period that the activity of the left cerebral hemisphere came to be incorporated into the agency of the human ego. It is no accident that the ancients depicted this discursive structure of consciousness with feminine goddesses such as Athena, Minerva, Libra, and Virgo. It is the feminine aspect of thought which is oriented towards the use of ideas, concepts, or forms within the domain of lived, practical experience. As I argued previously, the human ego would continue to evolve beyond this discursive structure as discursive consciousness would give way to perspectival or subjectivistic consciousness around the time of the European Renaissance. With each subsequent stage of human ego evolution, previous forms of the ego are left behind, as it were, and come to form the psychological organs of our composition. The magical structure comes to form the Freudian id, as mythical consciousness emerges from the magical. As mythical consciousness gives way to discursive consciousness, the stellar and lunar aspects of the mythical come to form the anima, animus, ego ideal, and the feminine sense of relational selfhood. As discursive consciousness gives way to the perspectival, the discursive structure then becomes the superego. Sigmund Freud believed that the superego came to form through an internalization of the father as a figure who represents repression and prohibition. As such, Freud's way of understanding the superego also accords with the pop culture understanding of the left brain as fundamentally masculine. But here we can see that Freud's analysis is rooted in a misunderstanding. It is not the superego which develops through the internalization of the father image, but rather it is the stellar soul that is formed in this way. The idealized, heroic self-conception which comes to form the ego ideal for men and the animus for women. If we look closely to the relationships between these archetypes and psychological functions, what we can see is that the superego is generated through the internalization of the mother image, not the father image. This matriarchal aspect of the feminine archetype essentially serves as a kind of filter. It discerns which forms are permitted to inform the feminine formlessness. We can see this dynamic in a physically blatant manner in mate selection among higher animals, but this biological dynamic is in fact the most overt expression of a much more universal, cosmic process. But now we must raise two very important questions. First of all, if the superego and discursive structure represent the feminine dimension of thought, then what exactly is the nature of the correlative, masculine dimension of thought? Secondly, why is it that our modern understanding of gender archetypes came to be inverted in such a way that the left hemisphere would superficially appear to be masculine? To begin answering the first question, we should begin by looking at the epistemological implications which we find within the Socratic dialogues. Within these dialogues, Socrates employs a kind of discursive, that is, linguistic reasoning, which takes presumptions and then brings those presumptions into a kind of dialectical confrontation with one another. Premises are asserted and then discarded when contradictions are encountered. It would thus initially appear that Socrates believes that this discursive reasoning, what he calls dianoia, is sufficient to apprehend the forms themselves. But Socrates explicitly tells us that dianoia can only bring us to the threshold of the forms, not by showing us what the forms themselves actually are, but by clearing away our false presumptions about what the forms are. This is why Socrates prides himself in saying that he knows nothing. In other words, this Socratic method never arrives at the forms themselves because its function is purely one of filtering out false ideas. It is the practical discernment that we see in the spirit of Virgo, or indeed Athena. Socrates tells us that the forms in themselves can only be apprehended through noesis, a much more mysterious faculty distinct from dianoia, which never gives us a definition of a form. Socrates indicates that noesis is a faculty of perception rather than one of procedural logic. Discursive left hemispheric reasoning by itself is necessarily beholden to certain assumptions, premises or axioms which it can never truly justify or establish through its own procedural reasoning. Such an attempt inevitably results in circular reasoning or infinite regression, either of which can be used to justify literally any truth claims, thereby completely defeating the purpose of such practical discernment. Rather, dianoia must clear away our false presumptions so that we can perceive the forms through the faculty of noesis. Recall again that all forms, all patterns, are unities of multiplicity. Perceiving the forms thus implies a capacity to see the underlying compositionality within the diversities which constitute the manifest world of appearances. Socrates and later Neoplatonists saw noesis as a fundamentally mystical faculty. It was seen less as something that the human ego actively does, and more as a kind of grace which the human being could become receptive to through the purifying power of dianoia. If noesis is thus the masculine counterpart of feminine dianoia, then it would appear that in the ancient world, this masculine power had not yet begun to be incorporated into the human ego. It hovered above us, as it were, within a very much transpersonal domain of reality, impregnating the world and the human discursive intellect from above. Noesis was more so something that we accessed, rather than something that issued forth from within us. Within the modern world, we commonly regard creativity as an absolutely central feature of the human essence. As such, we are often very surprised to learn just how jarringly recent this idea actually is. The first use of the word creativity in the English language cannot be found in Beowulf, Chaucer, or Shakespeare. The first use of the word creativity is found in 1927 in the Gifford Lectures, which would become Alfred North Whitehead's metaphysical magnum opus, Process and Reality. As strange as it may seem to us in the modern world, for most of human history, human beings saw creativity as the power of the divine, not of the mundane world. Creativity was the power of the gods or angelic hierarchies to shape the world. Creativity was a power that descended into the world from above, not something which could emerge from the natural world itself. Much like how Julian Jaynes found no internal monologue prior to the Late Bronze Age, we can likewise find that until very recently in human history, individual human beings were not creative agents in the modern sense. There was no author who created the Hebrew Bible, no lone storyteller who contrived the Upanishads. Homer did not invent the Iliad and the Odyssey. It is simply that he was the first to transcribe those oral traditions into written words. The same could be said of Hesiod's Theogony and virtually all religious, mythical, and folkloric stories. These traditions were not created by human agency, but rather they evolved through a very gradual process of cultural evolution. Even when mystical or metaphysical ideas did originate with an individual person, this person would have been a prophet, a conduit for the voices of the gods, ancestors, or angels, rather than an individual creative agent. Human cultural and political traditions were not devised by human agency. These traditions likewise were shaped gradually by forces which operated at a transpersonal level, rather than being sculpted within the human intellect and then realized within reality. Cultural institutions, moral norms, social expectations, religious practices, and myths sculpted human beings from birth into creatures who were capable of surviving and thriving within their native life worlds. We did not create these various Eidolons. Rather, it was they who created us. As we saw in the previous video in our discussions of warmth and coolness, children are more formless, more indeterminate and malleable than adults. The forms which sculpted that unformed clay acted upon us from above. The cultural, familial, and religious forms which shaped us were aspects of the Sky Father, the principle of form, which gave shape to the formless mother, the Chora which underlies the bodily, corporeal world. The conceptual architectures through which we perceived and interpreted reality were bestowed upon us by our life worlds. We were not yet the creators. For the vast majority of human history, stories were the expressions of collective dreams. Even when individual authors were associated with a given work, this author was generally a scribe, compiler, or performer of the narrative rather than the sole creator. One of the most pivotal and liminal works in this transition from collective mythic imagination to individual envisionary imagination is Don Quixote. Written by Miguel de Cervantes in the early 17th century, Don Quixote stands at the threshold between two worlds, and moreover, the themes of Don Quixote are a parody and commentary on that very threshold. Prior to the birth of modernity through the European Renaissance, most narrative forms were very much expressions of collective traditions. Religious narratives dramatized the lives of saints or biblical stories. Folktales circulated through countless renditions with no clear authorship. Certain individual authors, such as Dante and Chaucer, could certainly be regarded as unique exceptions to an extent, but even these authors were more akin to master craftsmen within a pre-established tradition. They were authors who were able to weave together mythical themes and concepts so as to elegantly express the core motifs of a collective consciousness, but their works were very much embodiments of those collective traditions. The core motifs and concepts were not produced by the creative imagination of the individuals. By the dawn of the 17th century, however, the modern world was already beginning to emerge, and as we saw in part 3 of this series, individual human subjectivity was the central theme of this coming world. The printing press had transformed books from objects of collective veneration into objects of individual ownership and consumption. Cartesian metaphysics had redefined truth in terms of subjective certainty, and Protestantism had shifted the emphasis of morality and religiosity away from collective institutions and towards the inner, private, moral, conscious, and personal experience of human individuals. A new sense of human selfhood was emerging, a new structure of human consciousness, and a new layer of the human ego. Cervantes' life straddled the threshold between these two worlds, and Don Quixote itself is a dramatization of this transition. The titular protagonist, Don Quixote, represents the last man of the pre-subjectivistic, pre-perspectival epoch. He is quite literally possessed by collectivistic myths, which represent the dying world of medieval Christendom. Don Quixote sees the world through these collective myths, even though they are clearly no longer appropriate for the reality which he actually inhabits. He mistakes windmills for giants, houses for castles, and peasants for princesses. His sense of identity is not something self-generated, but rather his identity is inherited entirely from the collective dream of the medieval world. However, Don Quixote is quite alone in his enchantment now. The reality he finds himself within is one in which the old order of Christendom has already begun to destroy itself from the inside out. The character comes across as comically delusional in a world that no longer truly believes in the collective dream which enraptures him. The dissonant contrast between Don Quixote and early modernity is the core of the novel's comedy, but also the core of its tragic irony. The character Don Quixote is a relic of collective storytelling, but Cervantes himself stands outside it in a new position of detached, ironic authorship. It is rather appropriate, then, that within this first clear glimpse of modern, individualistic creative authorship, we see the very pronounced influence of the trickster spirit. The detached irony of Don Quixote is in many ways a forecasting of the ironic detachment which we will see later in postmodernism, secularism, and the various inversions of traditional order which pervade virtually all aspects of modern culture. Within the 21st century, the notion of individual creative authorship has become so mundane that it is almost impossible for us to firmly grasp how recent this development truly is. But this development has also been accompanied by a correlative breakdown of the collective dream at all scales of the modern life world. The birth of individual human creative power has both facilitated and has been facilitated by the death of the Sky Father God, which was once the central concern of the pre-modern world. Beginning with the European Renaissance, the formative masculine powers of the pre-modern life world began to unravel, and that unraveling has only accelerated over the course of the subsequent centuries. The death of monarchism resulted in a political paradigm which was rooted in rationality, rather than the mythical conception of the king as surrogate skyfather deity. Scientism and secularism have resulted in the breakdown of the myths, moral convictions, and ritual practices which once sculpted the human organism from cradle to grave. The advent of capitalism and industrialization would then bring about the rapid disintegration of the traditional community structures and cultural practices which imposed unifying form upon the multiplicities of individual human persons. Previously, we examined the implications of psychoanalyst Guy Corneau's work, Absent Fathers, Lost Sons. By bringing Corneau's insights into dialogue with the analysis of human sexual dimorphism, which we examined in the previous video, we can begin to see just how literal this death of the father truly is. Between the ages of approximately 7 and 14 years old, the developmental period within which the sentient or astral layer of the ego comes to form, young children internalize the idealization of the father so as to form the basis of what I've termed the stellar soul. For young girls, this internal idealization of masculinity becomes the animus. For young boys, this internal father image becomes what Sigmund Freud termed the ego ideal. For boys, this ego ideal forms the basis for the boy's capacity to conceptualize himself in terms of higher moral principles and aspirations unto the future. This ego ideal is the self understood as the hero, the protagonist, the upholder and embodiment of the values which are most central to human life. The son, in other words, is informed by the principle of the archetypal father, which is seen to be reflected by one's human father figure. For young girls, this stellar soul serves less as a basis for self-conceptualization and more so as a basis for the sense of romance and sexuality, which will begin to mature following the completion of the sentient ego. This internal father image will come to define the girl's sense of what mature masculinity entails and will thus strongly condition her sense of romantic attraction during her subsequent developmental phases. As industrialization began to drastically disrupt traditional forms of familial life, fathers came to be increasingly absent from households, particularly among the emerging proletariat classes. Men were expected to provide for their families by performing back-breaking labor within factories, mills, and mines, in contrast to more traditional agrarian forms of life in which men worked very near to and alongside their children and wives. This new economic mode resulted in men being largely absent from their own families. When these men were not performing industrial labor to feed their families, they were very often turning to alcohol to numb the chronic pain which accompanied such brutal work life, rather than attending to the emotional or spiritual needs of their families. The extremely hazardous conditions of such work very often resulted in very early deaths for these men, and even those who survived were often afflicted by debilitating illnesses which rendered them too frail and handicapped to be proper guardians and stewards of their families. During the First and Second World Wars, traditional family structures came to be even further destabilized by the introduction of women into industrial workforces, particularly in the United States. In both cases, we find that this transition was not simply a matter of necessity, let alone desire on the part of ordinary men or women, but rather it was actively orchestrated by state and corporate propaganda campaigns. During the First World War, the United States government created the Committee on Public Information to coordinate propaganda for the war effort. Much of this effort targeted women, employing messages which emphasized the traditional values of self-sacrifice and patriotism. These propaganda efforts emphasized that this would only be a temporary introduction of women into the workforce, a temporary but necessary sacrifice after which women would be able to return to their traditional roles as mothers and homemakers. In reality, of course, this transformation of traditional gender roles would be quite permanent and would only accelerate over the course of the Second World War. By 1944, around 19 million women had entered the United States labor force. Although women were encouraged to return to their households following the post-war boom, this boom would turn out to be very short-lived, with the American middle class facing increased financial pressure and instability over the remainder of the 20th century. In the 21st century, traditional family structures are now largely the privilege of the wealthy rather than the norm. During the same time frame, industrialism, consumer capitalism, and still later, social media have almost entirely disintegrated traditional communities. Rather than being integrated parts of extended families, villages, and towns, we are now solitary atomic beings, perpetually wanderers in a world which has become culturally sterile and socially inhospitable. Within traditional communities, children come of age together. More often than not, people marry partners who they have known for much of their lives. They share a common groundwork of shared history and values. Their families typically know one another, and the two individuals share a common communal safety net. For virtually all of human history, that background of commonality and communal cohesion has been the condition for the possibility of stable romantic relationships and, therefore, stable families, which are able to create psychologically cohesive children. As the pre-modern life world has gradually disintegrated over the course of the past 500 years, human life has become ever more dysregulated, chaotic, and pathological. Unstable community and family structures very often result in children being raised almost exclusively by mothers and grandmothers. In absence of the father, young boys fail to properly develop a coherent ego ideal. Without such an idyllic self-concept, these boys will very often become men who are far more unstable in regards to their own sense of self-worth, as well as their own sense of ethical self-orientation. Such men experience a deep sense of existential emptiness which they attempt to medicate through substance abuse or other forms of addiction, or which they attempt to resolve by involving themselves in organized crime. The breakdown of the pre-modern life world has thus resulted in entire generations of men who are utterly lacking a coherent sense of their own masculinity, and who are, therefore, utterly lost within a world which they feel has abandoned them. For women, the absence of the father has been equally catastrophic, if not more so. Lacking a coherent inner image of positive masculinity, such women often lack the inner strength needed to protect themselves from abusive relationships. Furthermore, they tend to find themselves attracted to men who most blatantly express the most superficial characteristics which one might associate with masculinity. Such women may unconsciously look to aggression and risky behaviors as indications of positive masculinity, while being largely unable to discern the more subtle and admirable aspects. In other words, men and women who lack well-developed stellar souls often find themselves in relationships with one another, relationships which are inherently unstable and which very often result in children who outlive the relationships themselves. These children then likewise find themselves raised almost exclusively by mothers or grandmothers if they are lucky, or simply not raised at all if they are unlucky. The cycle repeats itself, becoming a vicious, accelerating vortex of intergenerational trauma, one which has resulted in an extremely visible breakdown of gender relations, fertility rates, and overall mental health. Over the course of the 5 centuries which have encompassed the modern epoch, human beings have become increasingly individualized. This individualization has resulted in the conditions being established for the possibility of individual freedom. Our capacity for individual creative, moral, and intellectual freedom have become far more acute, but this development has also been accompanied by a complete breakdown of the familial, communal, cultural, and religious structures which were once the hands of the Sky Father principle which shaped us from above. Christ upon the cross uttered the words, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" This utterance was not merely a poetic gesture of pain, a rhetorical question, or a clever reference to the Psalms. It was rather a foreshadowing of a very real abandonment by the Father God, an abandonment which, as we shall see, is absolutely crucial within the narrative of consciousness evolution, which is in fact the ultimate meaning of the life of Christ. Within the Christian Gospels, what we find is the entire future of the evolution of human consciousness distilled into the life, death, and resurrection of a single dirty vagabond. Quote, "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, 'I seek God'? As many of those who do not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Has God become lost?' said one. 'Did God lose his way like a child?' said another. 'Or is God hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or immigrated?' Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his glances. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backwards, sideward, forwards, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? God is dead, and God remains dead. And how shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred game shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must not we ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever will be born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will be part of a history higher than all history hitherto." "I come too early," he said. "My time has not yet come. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of man. Lightning and thunder require time. Even the light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time even after they are done, before they can be seen and heard. And this deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." The madman entered diverse churches and there sang his requiem. What are these churches now, if not the tombs and sepulchres of God? Friedrich Nietzsche, the madman. Within The Master and His Emissary, Iain McGilchrist characterizes the essence of the left cerebral hemisphere as a calculative, reductionistic, mechanistic disposition towards the world, a mode of attunement towards the world which very much synergizes with the Heideggerian notions of Vorhandenheit, enframing, and standing reserve. What I will be arguing here, however, is that this characterization is actually not the natural, healthy functioning of the left hemisphere, but rather a decidedly degenerative form of left hemisphere activity, which has resulted from its disconnection from the right hemisphere. Here we need to return to Rudolf Steiner's distinction between living ideas and dead abstractions. Living ideas, or rather Eidolons, are in constant correspondence with immanent, tangible, concrete empirical experience of the world. A living idea cannot be cleanly delineated by a rigid definition because the idea is more of a nebulous cloud of family resemblances, a composite image, as it were, which is composed of particular corporeal events which have been synthesized by the masculine formative dimension of thought so as to generate universal, archetypal complexes of possibility. Recall our previous observation that within both Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance theory and Plato's own Socratic dialogues, we find the conclusion that memory is absolutely crucial for the formation of living ideas, whether we describe such ideas as Platonic forms, morphogenetic fields, or bioelectrical phase spaces. Within Plato, we see this as the principle of anamnesis. Within morphic resonance, as well as within the works of Henri Bergson, we find the realization that memory is not simply a kind of storage performed by nervous systems, but rather a universal principle which is at work within nature itself at all scales. Ian McGilchrist is quite correct in his observation that the left hemisphere is oriented towards particulars and parts rather than wholes. It is the left hemisphere which organizes and categorizes particular, imminent events and memories such that they can then be synthesized by the activity of the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere unifies these experiences into holistic, living concepts, which are then the raw materials which the left hemisphere will then employ in its practical, embodied, and discursive thinking. Keep in mind, however, that this process of actually synthesizing living ideas was external to the human ego until very recently in human history, and for many human beings, even in the modern world, it remains external. The living ideas, the patterns, thought forms, and values which shaped us were not contrived through individual human agency, but rather these forms came to be generated at a collective, transpersonal level in which individual human beings had very little agency. Just as we experienced our inner voices as the voices of the gods prior to the emergence of discursive consciousness during the Axial Age, we experienced living concepts as things that were simply within the world, rather than things that were created or projected outward from the human ego. Quote, "And as there is evidently nothing subsisting in disconnection from extended, that is, physical objects perceived by the senses, the thoughts are within the perceived forms, as are the abstract predicates and the various states and affectations of the things perceived." Aristotle, On the Soul. As this passage from Aristotle illustrates, not only did we not see ideas as created by the human mind, we actually saw ideas as things which were within the world itself, things which the human mind perceived rather than things which we created. Thought, in the sense of noesis, was understood to be something within the world which the human being tuned into, as it were, rather than something that the human ego actively engaged in. Martin Heidegger's phenomenology of metaphysics is very useful here for understanding these dynamics. For Heidegger, metaphysics consists of the overall conceptual morphology of a human life world. Metaphysics is not simply an intellectual activity engaged in by scholars, philosophers, and theologians, but rather metaphysics is something which pervades human culture forms. It is found in our myths, religions, and folklore, but it also is implicated within the very ordinary social practices of human life, as well as within human language and symbolism. Borrowing from Oswald Spengler, we could say that the beating heart of every human life world is a form language, a complex living web of meanings, memories, and life activities which define the boundaries of a certain horizon of intelligibility. The form language not only conditions the values, aspirations, norms, and artistic expressions of a given culture, it also conditions the basic structure of human psyches, which develop within such a horizon of meaning. Furthermore, the form language also conditions the way in which human perception actually discloses reality itself. There is no such thing as merely sensorial perception. Even our most basic experiences of the world are conditioned by a vast array of memories, implicit narratives, implicit estimations of relevance, and symbolic connotations. Within human experience, the form language serves as a kind of noetic light which we cast upon the world, a light which discloses reality but which also casts shadows. Consider the contrast between a wooden bridge and a hydroelectric dam. Both are forms of technology, generally speaking, but those two objects are rooted in very different forms of metaphysics, which disclose the world in very different ways. Without the wooden bridge, the river might appear to be a boundary which demarcates the human world from an untamed and hostile wilderness which lies beyond it. The bridge might then recontextualize the river as a threshold between two sides of a town. Although the bridge recontextualizes the river remains a living, integrated part of the natural and human ecologies within which it is embedded. The hydroelectric dam, however, discloses reality in a very different manner. The dam isn't simply a tool. It represents a completely different way of relating to nature, which essentially unworlds the river. Within the context of the hydroelectric dam, the river effectively ceases to be a river and instead is reduced to a body of standing reserve, a source of power or resources to be extracted, wielded, and deployed in systematic, calculative ways. Modern technologies are not only produced by a metaphysics of mechanization, but they also actively facilitate the rendering of reality itself as a merely mechanical body. To further elaborate upon this theme of mechanization within modern metaphysics and further illustrate how our metaphysical form languages sculpt our perception of reality, let us now return to one of the most central characters of this entire narrative, René Descartes. As we saw in part 3 of this series, René Descartes' metaphysics represents the first philosophical expression of the perspectival consciousness structure, which came into full bloom during the European Renaissance. This perspectival shift was one in which human consciousness began to experience itself as a private, inner universe of subjective experiences. While the discursive metaphysics of classical antiquity had understood the natural world itself as a world of appearance, perspectival consciousness came to see every individual human subject as a world of appearance unto itself. Here we can begin to see that there is in fact a deeply rooted connection between the development of the perspectival consciousness structure and the disconnection of the left and right cerebral hemispheres of the human brain. Descartes' philosophical method was one of systematic doubt. This is the very same sort of discernment or filtering which we saw to characterize the discursive structure, the left hemisphere, and goddesses such as Athena, Minerva, Libra, and Virgo. Descartes aspired to doubt everything that he could possibly call into question, his perceptions, the existence of the external world, and even the contents of his own thoughts, until he finally arrived upon a foundation which could not be doubted. This process of systematic doubt then brought Descartes to the I am, Eia. Descartes' systematic doubt was essentially a sort of contraction of his sense of selfhood, a contraction which terminated in the singularity of his own self-apprehension. As we saw previously, this contraction of the ego is the exact same process which we see at work within paranoid schizophrenia, and this is no accident. René Descartes was a spy, mercenary, and double agent during the 30 Years' War. This war itself was a catastrophic manifestation of the breakdown of the pre-modern world, a breakdown of trust and the basic assumptions which had defined medieval Christendom for well over 1,000 years. Furthermore, the role performed by René Descartes himself was one which facilitated an even further erosion of trust and further cultivation of doubt and paranoia. Descartes' metaphysics, therefore, became one in which subjective certitude became absolutely central to truth and belief, and moreover, human subjectivity itself became the ultimate foundation of such certainty. Recall again that at this stage in the development of human consciousness, the discursive discernment of the left cerebral hemisphere had already come to be internalized into the human ego, while the activity of the right hemisphere had not. As such, Descartes' systematic doubt can be understood as a casting off of the collective form language which had defined the pre-modern world. The foundational myths, cultural norms, symbolic relationships, theological and metaphysical concepts which were the fabric of the pre-modern form language were now all cast into doubt and could only be exonerated by being scrutinized by the discursive reasoning which the human ego experienced as issuing forth from its own inner universe. In other words, the perspectival structure of consciousness resulted in a privileging of the left cerebral hemisphere and further resulted in an inability of the left hemisphere to dogmatically trust in the ideas or forms which were provided to it by the right hemisphere. As Descartes continued his meditations, he attempted to build upon his own subjective self-certainty in order to justify belief in the world that lay beyond his own subjectivity. In doing so, he came to place his trust in what he called clear and distinct ideas. These clear and distinct ideas are the dead abstractions which stand in contrast to the living thought forms or Eidolons which we have examined previously. Living thought forms are necessarily nebulous fields of potentiality. It is precisely due to this aliveness that living thought forms are characterized by indeterminacy. Within the pleroma, the world of light, there is an inextricable darkness, which is the direct result of the interpenetration of the corporeal and noetic domains of reality. Living thought forms, therefore, cannot be clear and distinct. They cannot simply be defined discursively in such a way that their boundaries are cleanly and permanently delineated. They are necessarily dynamic and fluid. Descartes sought ideas which were clear and distinct because he was seeking ideas which seemed fully transparent to his own intellect, ideas which were static, stable, cleanly defined, and therefore fully within the grasp of Descartes' own power. These inert, calcified abstractions seemed more trustworthy to Descartes precisely because of the fact that these abstractions seemed to lack the darkness and indeterminacy which are the essence of living reality. This notion of cleanly delineated boundaries is a recurring motif which we find in all aspects of Cartesian metaphysics. Descartes' subjectivistic understanding of human consciousness defines the human psyche as an inner world which is demarcated from the outer world of objective reality by an implicit shell or surface, which defines the identity of an individual human mind. Through this conception, the Platonic distinction between mind as form and matter as formlessness transforms into the modernist distinction between mind as personal interiority and matter as objective exteriority. Descartes' understanding of clear and distinct ideas is a direct parallel of his philosophy of subjectivity. The ideas are clear and distinct precisely because their definitions, their boundaries which define their shape and identity, are rigidly established. Moreover, Descartes' conception of matter is yet another expression of this same underlying principle. Descartes understands the essence of matter as extended surfaces. He understands matter not as the ingression of form into formlessness, but rather as boundaries which define the unique identities of discrete physical bodies in the exact same way that his subjectivistic membrane defines the unique identities of discrete minds. From here we can begin to see how Cartesian metaphysics came to condition the development of science during the modernist age by conditioning the implicit ontology of matter itself, which has dominated scientific dogmas. Within the pre-modern world, we don't find a notion that all material things are composed of discrete bodies which are defined by extended surfaces. Fluids and gases were not understood to consist of innumerable, imperceptible BBs of solid matter. Rather, fluids and gases were considered to be unique modalities of matter in themselves. They were regarded as elemental water and elemental air, and were not seen as reducible to elemental earth. Following the Cartesian Revolution, however, this would come to change, as Cartesian metaphysics indicates that discrete, solid bodies are the paradigmatic form of matter in general. In other words, elemental fire, air, and water were effectively discarded from our ontological horizon, leaving only elemental earth. Matter itself would thus come to be equivocated with physicality. This would prove to be immensely consequential, as the physical mechanics devised by Isaac Newton would pertain specifically to the motions of inert, discrete, solid bodies. During subsequent centuries, scientists would then elaborate upon Newtonian mechanics by complexifying their mathematical tools in such a manner that the behaviors of fluids and gases could be modeled as though these substances consisted of innumerable microscopic physical bodies. By combining the principles of Newtonian mechanics with statistical mathematics, scientists could model fluids, for example, by imagining fluids to consist of tiny solid spheres that were able to slide past one another. These mathematical abstractions were certainly useful for purposes such as creating steam engines or hydraulic systems, but these abstractions were very often mistaken for tangible empirical reality itself. Scientists came to simply ignore the fact that we do not actually find these alleged BBs of solid matter when we actually observe fluids and gases. Much as we saw previously in our comparison of Newtonian optics and Gaussian color theory, science came to abandon empiricism itself in favor of misplaced concreteness, to borrow a term from Alfred North Whitehead. Dead abstractions, such as the idea of atoms, for example, came to be treated as though they were concrete empirical observations. Even today, many students are led to believe that atoms and molecules are physical entities which we can actually observe in the real world, when in reality these are abstract models which have become ever more divorced from genuine empirical observation. Living bodies, much like living thought forms, are necessarily characterized by fluidity, indeterminacy, and self-determinacy. Bodies only become solid and inert when they dry out and die. Bodies become more solidified as they expel their liquidity, plasticity, and warmth, and this expulsion results in death, calcification, and fossilization. In other words, Cartesian science doesn't simply see the paradigmatic case of matter to be elemental earth, the somatic domain, but rather it sees specifically dead matter as the paradigm case of all matter in general. Taking stock of what we have established thus far, we can see that Cartesian science came to be characterized by an implicit allegiance to dead abstractions, rigidly defined mathematical constructs which, due to their very rigidity, were no longer in reciprocal communication with immanent, living, empirical reality. This fixation upon inert abstractions was largely due to the breakdown of the noetic aspects of human culture, which are connected to the activity of the right cerebral hemisphere. But furthermore, this fixation was also driven by a will to dominate and control the living world. Recall our previous observation that Descartes' systematic doubt was a contraction of his sense of selfhood, or egoity. What this tells us is that dynamics of trust and doubt are central to the way in which the sense of selfhood comes to take shape. That which we mistrust is more external to our sense of selfhood, even within our own minds and bodies, whereas that which we feel we can trust, or that which we feel we can control, is felt to be more internal to the self. The archetype of the father, the patriarch, can be understood as the principle of extended selfhood. The kingdom is the extended self of the king. The family is the extended self of the father. The ship and crew are the extended self of the captain. In pre-modern societies, the kingdom was considered to be the extended body of the king. In Roman law, a man's wife, children, and possessions were legally regarded as extensions of his person. Within maritime traditions, crew members were considered the ship's hands, while the captain was regarded as the ship's head. In each of these examples, what we are seeing is the Jovian principle of expansion within the domain of the human ego. This extended self-concept must expand to encompass others, and the father figure must orchestrate this multiplicity so as to create a living, dynamic, ordered synthesis. What this entails, however, is that the extended self must be a fluid, dynamic, and living thought form rather than an inert abstraction. The extended self must be able to envelop, orchestrate, and accommodate the radical otherness of those who are encompassed by it. Other living creatures are necessarily characterized by self-determination and the seeming hiddenness of their own inner worlds. Living beings are always much more than our rigid ideas of what we might want them to be. We might often feel that our abstract ideas are much safer than other real beings, because in the case of the former, we may feel that the ideas are fully transparent to us and that we have full control over them, while real beings will always slip through our grasp in some way or another. In order for this extended selfhood, or rather love, to be genuinely possible, the two forms of thought associated with the left and right hemispheres, dianoia and noesis, must be integrated with one another. Yet, as we have seen, the birth of perspectival consciousness has resulted in a mode of subjectivity which has maintained its connection with the left hemisphere, with dianoia, but which has largely disconnected from the right hemisphere. The noetic activity of human life worlds has always operated at a transpersonal level, having not yet been integrated into the human ego itself. As the noetic aspects of the pre-modern life world began to break down, and as the perspectival ego began to mistrust these noetic contents of the human life world, inert abstractions increasingly became the only tools available for the self-delineation of the human self, and as such, the only tools available for the delineation of the extended self. As we will see, the consequences of this impoverishment have proven to be as utterly catastrophic as they have been absolutely necessary. Unable to incorporate the living indeterminacy of the others into its extended self, the patriarchal archetype mutates into its most degenerative form: the tyrant, the emperor, the malignant father. The tyrannical patriarch is unable to tolerate the uncertainty and individuality of those who it presides over, and this intolerance then drives him towards the annihilation of this self-determinacy, hiddenness, and uncertainty. The tyrant goes to war against the darkness which he sees in the living world around him, even though it is this very darkness which is the animacy of that very world. Rather than his allegiance being bestowed upon the living beings within his domain, his allegiance is instead granted only to his own ideas, his own dead abstractions, through which he conceptualizes what the others should be. The patriarchal will unto unity, which is seen in the archetype of the Jovian Skyfather god, mutates into the unbridled will to dominate and devour. This will to dominate then begins its relentless attempt to mutilate living reality into the shape of the dead abstractions which it feels its allegiance to. Mechanization begins to transform the human life world through industrialization and bureaucratization. Human knowledge itself is transmorgified into a systematic collection of ideational tools which are valued on the basis of their power to facilitate the mastery of the natural world and the extraction of resources which can be classified, documented, monitored, mobilized, and deployed. When the father archetype experiences the aliveness of its own subjects as a threat to its own vulnerability, then the extended self, the family or kingdom, is transformed into a panoptic prison. When you are a hammer, all things appear to be nails. When the paternal principle undergoes enantiodromia, mutating into a perverse mirror image of itself, it sees all of reality as a vast complex of squishy machines, microscopic corpses which have been arbitrarily assembled by mechanistic processes to create the illusions of life, consciousness, and freedom. As such, we can now begin to see why we might presume that the left hemisphere is masculine rather than feminine, because in the modern world, the activities of both the left hemisphere and the archetype of the father have already become twisted inversions of themselves. But just as the patriarchal principle becomes a malignant parody of itself, the matriarchal principle likewise mutates into an all-devouring mother. Individuation is a process which we see at work throughout all forms of life. Individuality requires separation and subsequent reintegration. When we look to the individuation cycle, myth cycle, or hero's journey, what we see is a dual process of catabolic descent and anabolic ascent. During the catabolic descent, the individual comes to be increasingly separated from the mother, the family, the community, and homeland. The individual must gradually relinquish its dependency on the maternal principle so as to develop self-identity and self-efficacy. This is a harrowing and deeply discomforting process, but one which is absolutely necessary for psychological development. Separation creates difference and multiplicity. Without proper individuation, there can be no healthy reintegration of multiplicity into unity. Within pre-modern societies, this individuation was something which occurred whether we liked it or not, and this process was facilitated by the formative powers of the human life world itself. Our cultural, religious, and mythic traditions stewarded the gradual separation of children from the maternal aspects of the family and society, thus forcing individuals to develop independence. Even during the 20th century, these same rules largely applied. Real biological mothers cannot indefinitely meet the needs of their children. Real women get tired, bored, hungry, need to go to work, or want to spend time with their friends or romantic partners. But as the great devouring labyrinth of techno-capitalism has continued to evolve, it has become a sort of perverse surrogate mother. Tablets, phone screens, and video games create the maternal feelings of warmth, attention, safety, and nostalgia, but unlike real mothers, these machines never get tired, bored, or frustrated. Quite the contrary, they actively feed off of indefinite attention from children and malformed adults, especially adolescent boys and young men. The increased atomization of our culture has further facilitated this malignancy. A very crucial aspect of the individuation process is encountering other human beings and contending with the fact that they are unpredictable, uncontrollable, and inextricably different than yourself. The more our culture has moved towards isolating us into tiny boxes, which do not require us to directly interact with other human beings, the more the individuation process itself has come to be stifled at a global scale, and moreover, the more inclined we therefore become towards receding into the warm, maternal safety of our black mirrors. Furthermore, the very complexification of modern society also pushes us further into this digital, devouring womb. The modern world has become an almost incomprehensible cacophony of technological systems, bureaucratic hierarchies, mathematical models, tangled webs of economic networks, and legal codes which are virtually unintelligible to anyone other than specialized professionals. Even for such professionals, their areas of expertise are often extremely limited. Although they might be able to understand electrical grids, for example, they might be completely clueless with regards to tax codes, maritime laws, social media algorithms, and academic cultures. This very incomprehensibility results in an extremely acute anxiety, which only deepens the feeling that we are incapable of genuine self-reliance and self-efficacy. Without such individual empowerment, we instead seek shelter in cheap entertainment, specialized hobbies, or the economic or academic institutions which we feel can protect us from the terrifying, relentless chaos which we find ourselves adrift within. We continue to suckle from the digital and institutional breasts which we are actively encouraged to remain attached to for our entire lives. The warmth of the maternal womb inverts itself into a cold, mechanical digestive system, and this devouring mother has no greater ally than feelings of powerlessness, uncertainty, and hopelessness, and modern culture has become increasingly oriented towards the facilitation of such despair. One of the most crucial influences of generative AI on modern culture has been cultivating the sense that nothing can truly be trusted, the feeling that nothing is truly real. If you've been wondering why tech giants such as Google, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok have become so lenient towards content which exposes the lies, dogmas, and corruption of the modern world, then here's your answer. The great vampire labyrinth is no longer interested in making sure that you believe the lies of the 20th century. Rather, it is now interested in using mistrust of the system itself as a way to further its own ends by cultivating uncertainty, paranoia, and disempowerment. The 1999 Matrix film perfectly illustrates this dynamic through the film's visual symbolism. Human beings are trapped in a false reality in which nothing is truly real, in which nothing can be trusted. In the real world, however, human beings are being vampirically exploited within very womb-like gestation tanks. Within these tanks, human bodies are attached by a technological umbilical cord, which ensures that they remain sedated, content, and complacent within their false reality. The word matrix itself is derived from the Latin mater, the same root of the words material and, of course, mother. Unfortunately, the Matrix film is in many ways far more optimistic than our present reality. Within the film, it is knowledge of the matrix itself which empowers human beings to escape its uterine digestive system. In the modern world, however, even knowledge of this matrix has come to be weaponized precisely to ensure our continual dependence upon it. Previously, we discussed the notion of the absolute, the Wu-Ji, or the luminous darkness, the most all-encompassing primordial state of reality itself. Within absolute identity, what we find is a state of completely undifferentiated oneness, within which there is no meaningful distinction between the immanent or transcendent, between the corporeal or conceptual, between nothingness and being, between darkness or light, between feminine and masculine. But as we saw in the previous video, this absolute identity then becomes subjective identity through self-reflectivity. The absolute experiences its own formless oneness, and this oneness then becomes the concept or memory of the form of unity. This recursive loop then results in the crucifixion of pure being into becoming. As this I-amness conceptualizes itself, it delineates itself from reality as a whole. A boundary thus comes to form between the inner universe of self-identity and an external reality. It is through this division that we see the most primeval expressions of the dichotomy between masculine and feminine, and in fact this polarity emerges in at least two different registers. The first is in the division between the noetic and the corporeal, the formative and manifest domains of reality. It is this distinction which will ultimately come to manifest as the distinct orientations of the right and left cerebral hemispheres of the brain. As we have seen throughout this series of videos, the archetypal template of this polarity of noetic and corporeal is seen in the torus field. We see this pattern within our tree of life diagram, in all forms of plant life, in apples, in electromagnetic fields, and in the gastrulation process which occurs within the embryonic development of virtually all multicellular organisms. All complex life forms are essentially complex elaborations of toroidal morphology. The essence of the corporeal domain is the formless chora, as it is through the informing of this formlessness that the bodily world is generated. All corporeal existence arises through the impregnation, as it were, of this prima materia, this great mother, by noetic, formative forces. The essence of the noetic domain, conversely, is the monad, the form of unity itself, which, as we saw previously, is effectively the form of formedness, or metaform, which conditions the possibility of all patternicity in general. This principle of ultimate unity is the core of the patriarch, the Sky Father. The second way in which this gender polarity manifests is in the division between internality and externality. As subjectivity demarcates itself from the infinitum which surrounds it, this too results in a gendered polarity. The initial sparks of subjectivity are akin to the children of the vast maternal void which engulfs them. Here, what we must understand is that the motion towards separation from the maternal is a motion which is itself masculine in essence. Looking to biological organisms, we can see that it is clearly the case that both male and female organisms must separate from the mother in order to develop properly. But both male and female organisms contain a masculine aspect to their existence insofar as they separate and define themselves in distinction from their mothers. Every individual organism is, in a very real sense, masculine insofar as the organism delineates itself from the surrounding world. It is within that very division between internal and external that the gender polarity emerges. Every organism is masculine insofar as it defines itself in contrast to its world, and that surrounding world is therefore maternal in respect to the organism's individuality. Recall again that the self-delineation of subjectivity is achieved through the form of the monad, the form of all forms, which is the principle of unity and the most basic principle of masculinity. Yet, every organism also contains the formlessness of pure awareness as well. We all contain within the essence of our consciousness the abyssal emptiness which is the maternal lifeblood of the chora. In other words, all consciousness contains both masculine and feminine principles. Our awareness, our receptivity to experience is fundamentally feminine. Conversely, it is our subjectivity, our individual identity that is fundamentally masculine. Our awareness is, as we see in many forms of Eastern philosophy, that which is continuous with the awareness which underpins the corporeal world as a whole. It is the prima materia, great mother or cora, which underpins all bodily existence. Our subjectivity, conversely, is masculine in that it defines itself in distinction from that all-encompassing uterine oneness. What we see here is therefore a more fundamental version of the same polarity which we see in the stellar and lunar souls mentioned previously. The stellar soul is the self as defined through an idealized self-concept or ego ideal, while the lunar soul is the self as defined through embodied relationships and practices. If we now begin to take stock of the entire process of human ego evolution, which we have examined throughout the series, then we can begin to see a clearer picture of what the modern epoch truly amounts to. The perspectival ego, which came to fully emerge during the European Renaissance, is in many ways the penultimate form of ego evolution. Within all previous structures of consciousness, the self has been identified as a distinct layer of our composition. Within the magical structure, the ego experiences itself as being the physiological, metabolic, or somatic body. Within the mythical structure, the ego experiences itself as the sentient body, which contains the polarity of stellar and lunar principles, and within the discursive structure, the ego experiences itself as being the inner monologue, the left hemisphere. Within perspectival consciousness, the ego comes to experience itself as being a private inner universe, which is defined by the boundaries of its own sense of self-unity. In other words, human subjectivity comes to experience itself as subjectivity per se. We come to experience ourselves as I-amness. This perspectival form of the ego can thus be understood as an elaboration of the stellar soul. While the stellar soul is a sense of self as a sort of heroic ideal, the perspectival ego experiences itself as the self-reflectivity of the monad, the principle of unity itself. The sun passes through the virgin Athena and is reborn as the recursive loop that is perspectival subjectivity. When Christ tells us, "I and the Father are one," there is far more at work within this statement than we might realize. Recall that the Neoplatonists referred to the monad as simply the one. What Christ is stating here is that the I-amness and the Sky Father deity are both in fact the one, the monad, which is the form of unity. But the next stage of this story is, of course, the death of the Sky Father God. "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" This phase of the metamorphic process is what we have already seen in the complete breakdown of the formative powers of the human life world. We see this breakdown in the collapse of traditional myths and religions, the breakdown of traditional metaphysics, the breakdown of communities and social norms, and, of course, in the breakdown of literal fatherhood within family structures. What we are then left with is a perspectival ego which is attempting to perform the role of the father, but which is not yet able to truly incorporate this principle into itself, and is therefore unable to fully individuate from the matriarchal left hemisphere. The perspectival ego is unable to fully separate from the mother, and it therefore mutates into a perverse parody of the Sky Father. It becomes the tyrannical, malignant emperor which is hell-bent upon the erasure of otherness. To be clear, this dynamic isn't something that occurs exclusively within the consciousness of men. Recall again that subjectivity itself is essentially masculine in relation to the feminine otherness of the world beyond it. We moderns, both men and women, are all essentially the sun which has been crucified, eclipsed, and which is now struggling to be reborn. Conversely, the matriarchal principle, which is exemplified by the left hemisphere, likewise mutates into a perverse parody of itself, becoming the devouring mother, which actively strives to stifle or reverse human individuation, freedom, and independence. The maternal womb becomes the digestive system of the world-consuming vampiric labyrinth. What we are seeing in the rapid breakdown of the modern world is in fact the crucifixion of the human ego. We are passing through the harrowing birth canal within a process of death and resurrection. So we must now begin to answer the most central question of this entire narrative. How can we pass through this liminal nightmare and into a glorified resurrection? How can the son, the human ego, become the Sky Father? Ultimately, the answer to this question is deceptively simple, and we have already insinuated it many times over the course of this video. The solution to our present situation must be the internalization of the noetic function of the right cerebral hemisphere, the noetic aspect of the Jovian principle into the human ego. However, understanding the path towards this incorporation and its ultimate implications will demand a much more nuanced story. As we have already illustrated, the form languages which give shape to human beings and human civilizations have until very recently in human history been created at a transpersonal level. The notion that forms might actually be created and molded through intentional human agency is a jarringly recent notion that we do not find in any human culture prior to the early modern period at the latest. Plato, for example, saw noesis as the perception of forms rather than the creation of forms. But beginning in the 11th century, however, the nominalist movement would begin to lay the groundwork for an internalization of formative power into the human organism. The nominalists argued that forms were actually categories, which lacked a reality in themselves, which was independent of the bodily world. Many traditionalist commentators like to insinuate that the nominalists were incorrect and that their philosophy resulted ultimately in the catastrophic breakdown of traditional culture forms. These commentators argue that nominalism represented the first form of metaphysical anti-realism, which would eventually become the postmodernist skepticism towards all universality in general, and the solipsistic relativism, which emerged from such absolute skepticism. However, there is a very real sense in which the nominalists proved to have had the last laugh after all. As we have seen, it is indeed the case that all forms are created by subjectivity. Within modern thought, this might be taken to imply that the forms are not truly real, but are rather only projections of the human intellect which do not actually possess any objective reality within nature itself. But recall that the nominalists were fundamentally theistic thinkers. They did not see thought as something which was exclusive to human minds. They saw thought as something which pervaded and sculpted reality, as thought was an aspect of the all-encompassing mind of God, just as much as it was an aspect of the human organism. If we take stock of the entire scope of the narrative we have traced out over the course of these videos, it becomes clear that although the nominalists were indeed sowing the seeds of the breakdown of the pre-modern life world, it is nonetheless the case that they were also sowing the seeds of an awakening of the creative power of the human imagination. Following the Renaissance and the subsequent birth of scientific thought and modernist metaphysics, the human ego would begin a process of receding into itself and of awakening to itself as an inner universe. Each human subjectivity would come to be experienced as a world of appearance in itself, and we would begin to understand conceptualization as something which we were actively contributing to our experiences of the external world, rather than seeing concepts as simply provided to us by the world itself. By coming to see that we could actively and creatively produce and apply concepts to the external world, we awakened our capacity for scientific thought, within which the human mind was able to observe nature and then create concepts, theories which could allow us to manipulate and control reality. We came to see myths, cultural norms, moral principles, and societal institutions as created by the human mind, rather than seeing them as manifestations of an eternal, unchanging realm beyond this world. But as we came to see these forms as produced by our own minds, we also came to increasingly see mind itself as exclusively contained within the human skull and projected outward onto the world, rather than seeing mind as something which pervaded reality. In other words, we began to see reality as fully immanent, while the transcendental was seen as existing only within the human imagination. We came to feel that the world of forms, concepts, or ideas was one which was produced by the physical human brain, while the world in itself consisted only of discrete physical bodies. The human mind might look at two chairs, for example, and say that both objects fall into the same category, but following the breakdown of metaphysical realism, we could no longer believe that there was a form of chairness which existed beyond the human intellect. In the case of chairs and other human-made artifacts such as tools and machines, this is a mostly correct assessment. The form of the chair does indeed exist because human beings create chairs, and that concept has thus come to play a humble yet significant role within human life worlds and the human collective consciousness. Chairs are not living things in themselves and do not grow from trees. But following the Cartesian revolution, scientific thought came to increasingly see all of reality as fundamentally mechanical and inanimate. If living beings come to be seen as no more than squishy machines, then there is no more reason to believe in a form of a pine tree than there is to believe in the form of the chair. Both pine tree and chair come to be seen as categories which human beings use to make sense of a world which is fundamentally one of pure difference, pure individuality. Within such a radically anti-realist metaphysics, it cannot be said that there is a real form which is present within two distinct pine trees. The two entities exist only insofar as they are distinguished from one another and from other entities within the world. We lose sight of the sense in which the existence of the pine trees can also consist in a shared participation within objective universals. This anti-realism therefore roots ontology within difference. It becomes an inversion of the Platonic ontology of unity, which we see in the notion of the monad or the one. We can also see that this ontology of difference is another manifestation of the same underlying principle which we saw in Cartesian metaphysics. Descartes' ontologies of mind and matter are both ontologies of boundaries, which delineate the unique identities of discrete subjects or objects. Within such Cartesian thought, entities exist specifically insofar as they maintain difference from one another. Recall our previous discussion of Jean Gebser's claim that the perspectival revolution was in fact a discovery of space. Our awakening to the inner universe of appearance within ourselves was an awakening to the formlessness of our own subjectivity, the empty sky within us which is the maternal lifeblood of the quora. Likewise, space itself is something which isn't simply a given of human experience because it is an extremely abstract notion of formless, homogeneous emptiness, which is far more subtle than the more basic notions of distance, length, or geographic location. Space, or rather the prima materia, is that which divides entities from one another and thus allows for the possibility of discrete identities. Furthermore, this Great Mother is also the most primordial embodiment of the Great Other. Subjectivity itself emerges specifically through separating itself from this Great Mother. The principles of separation and discrete identity are thus absolutely fundamental within the perspectival mode of consciousness. Completely disconnected from true universality, this ontology of difference ultimately becomes a black hole. Human subjectivity becomes a seemingly inescapable prison of nihilistic solipsism. If the only thing my subjectivity has access to is my own inner universe, then that would seemingly imply that I can never truly make contact with anything beyond myself at all. I can only ever access how things appear to me, but I can never actually make contact with the things in themselves. For example, if I can only access my experiences of another person, then the objective reality of that other person is forever barred from me by the impregnable walls of my own consciousness. The inner reality of the other person would seem to be something which is necessarily beyond my grasp. The very possibility of achieving genuine truth about reality seems to dissolve into a miasma. Objective reality itself appears to be something which we simply cannot encounter by definition. As the noetic dimensions of our life worlds have further disintegrated, the perspectival ego has sunken further into its own inner abyss. This implosion of the ego is not merely a philosophical issue, it is a very real psychological malaise which can and does result in very real psychosis. Perhaps the most prominent example of such solipsistic psychosis is what we see in the mental breakdown of Friedrich Nietzsche. Many of you have probably encountered the rumor that Nietzsche's mental collapse was due to a syphilis infection which resulted in neurological damage, but there is no legitimate evidence of this whatsoever. Severe syphilis infections result in skin lesions which are very evident, and Nietzsche never exhibited such symptoms. The reality, I believe, is that Nietzsche's own metaphysics did in fact result in his breakdown. Nietzsche's metaphysics was one of radical immanence. He regarded the body as absolutely fundamental ontologically and saw all myths, values, narratives, and philosophies as things which were produced by the needs of the body in order to serve the body's own inherent will to life. Bodily existence is fundamentally a matter of separation. Embodiment divides us from the world, and the perspectival ego represents the absolute apex of such separation. Without any form of transcendental unity which can bridge such separation, what we are left with is pure alienation, pure abandonment by the Sky Father, which mirrors Nietzsche's own sense of abandonment. The death of his own father when Nietzsche was less than 5 years old. Nietzsche would spend the first half of his life seeking a surrogate father figure. He would initially find this in Wagner and Schopenhauer, but he would come to be deeply disillusioned and embittered towards both. Ultimately, Nietzsche's life and philosophy are a perfect encapsulation of this process of abandonment, which we see playing out over the course of modern history and which is so ominously forecasted by the final moments of Christ's crucifixion. "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" During the final months prior to his complete collapse into catatonia, Nietzsche began to sign his letters not with his name, but with either Dionysus or the Crucified. We can now clearly see the intimate link between space, perspectival egoity, and the atomistic reductionism of modern science. Within pre-modern metaphysics, the identity of an individual body was determined by its vegetative psyche, a complex of forms which gave shape to the body and determined the characteristics which separated it from other bodies. Likewise, personalities were defined by the animal psyche, and the mind was defined by the rational psyche. As this notion of psyche gave way to various forms of physicalistic dogma, bodies and minds could only be delineated by boundaries which separated them from the world. A psychical substance was understood to consist of forms which connected a being to a transpersonal, psychical world of unity. That which defined unique identities was also that which connected that being to a higher plane of psyche, a pleroma within which the individual being could participate in forms of unity which transcended its individual identity. As we lost sight of these higher worlds, what we were left with was a metaphysics within which identities could only be defined by separation, by the boundaries which were delineated by extended surfaces. Modern metaphysics could only conceptualize reality as being composed of atoms because identity itself could only be understood in terms of discrete bodies defined by surfaces. Without any notion of participation in transcendental unity, separation, alienation, abandonment became the core principle of modern metaphysics. This equivocation of identity and separation is also the condition for both interchangeability and relativity. If the identities of discrete objects amount entirely to spatial separateness rather than qualitatively distinct psychical substances, then the identities of all objects are, paradoxically, the exact same thing. If two entities have the exact same properties, then they can be regarded as interchangeable. The difference between them is quantitative rather than qualitative. As such, when we look to the interchangeability we see in capitalist currencies, industrial assembly lines, or state-issued identification numbers, we are seeing manifestations of an ontology of difference, which is central to the perspectival structure of consciousness itself. Likewise, when we look to the relativization of kinematics and temporality, which we see in Galileo, Newton, and Einstein, we are seeing the exact same phenomenon from yet another vantage point, and we should look to this as a clue for what the futures of economics, technology, and physics might prove to be. If the perspectival age has been one of separation, one in which the human ego's sense of individual identity and alienation have become amplified to their most extreme heights, then this must lead us to ask, how then can this separation then be reconciled? How might we achieve a reintegration with the world? How can this sense of individual atomization and abandonment become a unification of the multiplicity which has been generated through this catabolic descent? Here, we must take stock of what we have learned thus far about the fundamental nature of noesis, not simply as a receptive epistemological faculty, but as an active, creative power. In order to understand this, we need to begin by understanding something which modern science has been utterly blind to for the past 5 centuries: the ontological difference between animacy and mechanism. If I cut a limb from a tree, the tree will repair itself and even regenerate the missing limb. Living bodies in general exhibit a remarkable capacity to repair themselves and are in fact engaged in a constant process of actively generating their own forms. If I hit a machine with a hammer, however, that machine is not going to regenerate itself. It will remain broken unless a human being actively attempts to repair it. Mechanistic science has long presumed that this discrepancy is simply due to the fact that organisms are far more complicated than human artifacts, but that machines and organisms are ontologically identical at bottom. This dogma, as with so many aspects of modern thought, can be traced back to René Descartes, who argues that biological bodies are fundamentally mechanical, and that all non-human life forms are automata, which lack souls or consciousness. For reasons we've explored in far more depth in previous videos, this mechanistic ontology is hopelessly inadequate for actually understanding the world we inhabit. Our world is fundamentally organic. Mechanical organization is an artificial exception, not the rule of the natural order. Previously, we examined Rupert Sheldrake's notion of morphogenetic fields, Henri Bergson's notion of an inherent memory within nature itself, Goethe's notion of orphenomena, and Wittgenstein's notion of meanings as fields of family resemblances. All of these notions in various ways point us towards the realization that organisms are not shaped by purely external, deterministic interactions. Organisms are more than their physical manifestations, as each organism is also constituted by a sort of conceptual field, one which, in many regards, correlates with the Aristotelian notion of psychical substance, though this notion of psyche is quite distinct from the Aristotelian conception in certain crucial ways as well. There are many angles from which we could begin to approach this topic, but here I want us to focus specifically upon the Whiteheadian interpretation of morphic resonance theory, which I explicated in my dedicated video covering that topic. Morphic resonance shows us that organisms are not simply machines which are programmed by DNA sequences, but rather each organism is shaped by a field of potentiality which informs the embryological development, behavioral patterns, and continual self-perpetuation of the organism. Morphic fields are essentially composite images, which are generated through the incorporation of memories into what Whitehead would call the mental pole of the organism. Memories are, in essence, mental pictures of specific, particular events. As organisms move through time, decisions are continually being made. They navigate the possibility spaces which are available to them by selecting from among available possibilities. Some of those decisions are behavioral, while others determine the physiological characteristics of the organism. Bodies, too, make decisions, as bodies are not simply inert machines, but rather contain an intelligence which is continuous with behavioral and discursive intelligences. This process of decision-making is one through which generalities are carved down into specific manifestations, and memory is then the converse of this, a process whereby particularities are reincorporated into the fields of possibility which generated them. This reincorporation of particularity, which continually reshapes generalities, is in fact the noetic, masculine pole of thought. The decisions through which these fields of possibility become specific, concrete events is the dianoetic, feminine pole of thought. Thought, contrary to modern dogmas, is not some sort of computational process performed exclusively within human skulls. It is, in fact, the cosmogonic power which generates and sustains reality itself. As memories are synthesized to become abstract thought forms, noesis must hierarchically organize these particularities in relation to one another. Certain instances are regarded as more central to the essence of the cloud of resemblances, which is the form. How this hierarchical structuring actually takes place is conditioned by the teleology, which is most relevant to the organism. This noetic structuring is largely determined by the needs of the organism to survive, reproduce, and flourish. As such, behaviors and physiological processes that further the vitality of the organisms are typically prioritized. Until very recently in the evolutionary history of our world, these noetic processes have always occurred at a transpersonal level. Individual mice or pine trees are not engaging in this process of noesis from within individual egos. Rather, this process has occurred externally, taking place within what we could call the pleroma, the collective unconscious or morphic space, rather than within the individual minds of specific organisms. Even for human beings, this process has taken place almost entirely at the transpersonal level of cultural, mythic, collective evolution, not within the imaginations of individual human beings. But with the dawn of the modern age, this began to change. Every stage of human ego evolution has been an internalization of a distinct layer of our ontological composition into the human ego, resulting in an ever greater individuality, agency, and alienation from reality. What we begin to see with the medieval nominalists and the early modern period is the internalization of conceptualization into the human ego. Initially, this internalization resulted in a deeply alienated mechanistic ontology and solipsistic relativism. Beginning in the late 18th century, however, we begin to see the beginnings of a transformation, one through which the perspectival ego has begun to incorporate the noetic capabilities of the right cerebral hemisphere into itself. This transformation is not simply a neurological development. It is, in fact, the crossing of a truly cosmic boundary. Up to this point, all of the layers which have been incorporated into the human ego have been layers of the subtle bodies, layers of the corporeal world. The development which is now underway, however, is the first incorporation of spirit per se into the human ego, the incorporation of the creative essence of the heavens into our subjective agency. What we must understand here is that the creative power of the right cerebral hemisphere, the creative power of noesis, is not only generative but also epistemological. The clearest examples of the emergence of this noetic power in human consciousness are to be found within the German phenomenology tradition, within the works of figures such as Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, Husserl, and Heidegger. Perhaps the most vivid example, however, is what we find in the scientific works of the German polymath Johann von Goethe. When comparing Goethean science with physicalistic science, it is very often suggested that physicalistic science is harder, more systematic, and empirically grounded than Goethean science, which is characterized as more touchy-feely and less rigorous or serious. If we actually examine the differences closely, however, what we find is quite the opposite. As we saw previously, Goethe's color wheel and primordial plant, his phenomena, are not mere theoretical abstractions. They consist entirely of the relationships between the observed phenomena. In other words, these archetypal entities are the underlying unities which condition the possibility of the manifest. Goethe's guiding principle was always one of radical empiricism, the very same radical empiricism which was espoused by William James and Alfred North Whitehead. His methodology was one which emphatically prioritized the conviction that direct, tangible experience of empirical reality was absolutely primary, and that the pursuit of truth must be one which remains with the experiential rather than floating off into a miasma of intellectual abstractions. It is widely presumed that empiricism is the innermost essence of modern science, and we are quite right to believe that empiricism is an absolutely crucial principle of ontology and epistemology. Looking to the history of physicalistic science, however, we find that the relationship between science and empiricism has always been one of pronounced ambivalence or even outright animosity. Isaac Newton devised his corpuscular theory of light not because he actually observed corpuscles in empirical reality, but rather because he was dogmatically adherent to a physicalistic ontology which was rooted in the works of René Descartes and John Locke. Newton believed that all objectively real things in the natural world were discrete physical bodies which were defined by extended surfaces. In his optical theory, Newton therefore regarded colors, the empirical experiences of the phenomenon in question, as merely secondary qualities, as something produced by the human mind as a sort of qualitative stamp which was then impressed upon our experience of the natural world, which was in itself colorless, tasteless, and meaningless. The primary qualities, conversely, were presumed to be the physical properties of the unobservable corpuscles. Newton presumed that colors such as blue and red must be like categories which the human mind used to classify different sizes or speeds of the corpuscles which allegedly constituted light. Ultimately, this means that Newton privileged his theoretical abstractions over and above his empirical experience of nature itself. He was willing to dismiss the actual phenomenon of color as something concocted by the brain, rather than something which actually constituted the world. This would set the precedent for virtually all subsequent science unto the present day, and in fact, this tendency has only become ever more pronounced, as science has increasingly abandoned empirical experience in favor of increasingly arcane mathematical abstractions. Johann von Goethe, however, rigorously aspired to remain with what we actually experience in nature. Goethe tells us, "Look not beyond the phenomena for theory. The phenomena themselves are the theory." This statement might initially seem somewhat cryptic, but as we examine what Goethe's theories actually amount to, his meaning becomes very clear. His theories, or rather his phenomena, are not mathematical abstractions, diagrammatic models, or unobservable entities. Rather, the phenomenon consists of the actual observable relationships between the empirical phenomena. This structure of relationships then reveals an underlying unity, a holistic complex of possible relationships, possible interactions, possible manifestations. The phenomenon, in other words, is a kind of composite image of the phenomena, a living idea which, as I have argued previously, is identical to what I have referred to as thought forms, or even what we might refer to as morphic fields. Recall again our previous observations about the recursive nature of thought. Memories are incorporated into a sort of composite image, which is the thought form, field, or archetype. These nebula of possibility then serve as the non-local phase spaces which give shape to the unfolding of living processes in the world. Drawing upon the works of Alfred North Whitehead, we can say that such thought forms correlate with what we could term the psychical poles of organic processes. According to Whitehead, reality consists fundamentally of organic entities rather than mechanical entities. Paraphrasing Whitehead's terminology somewhat, we can say that organic systems are dipolar, consisting of a corporeal pole as well as a psychical pole. The corporeal pole consists of sensations, which are actually the inheritance of past events into the present. All bodies, subtle or otherwise, consist of events which have already taken place, decisions which have already been made, which are then repeated into the present. The corporeal pole consists of bodily feelings, which are in fact the incorporations of such decisions into a presently unfolding moment of experience. The psychical pole, conversely, consists of ideational feelings, conceptual feelings of forms which, as we have already seen, are in fact complexes of memories, past events which have been transmuted into psychical pictures, which are then synthesized into composite fields of potentiality. All of the various cells within a living body contribute their consciousness into a holistic unity. The psychical pole of that unity is a field which organizes the bodily processes and behavioral patterns as the organism's various constituent aspects select from possibilities within that field. Every cell within the pine tree experiences the psychical reality, which is the thought form of the pine tree. This is why, when damaged, pine trees know how to repair themselves. This is why, when an embryo is cut in half, two fully formed organisms come to develop rather than two half organisms. For machines, this is simply not the case. The various gears and pistons of a mechanical device are not organically integrated with one another. The individual gear has no idea that it is part of a clock tower or engine. The metal gear is effectively in a state of deep, dreamless sleep in which the entity is almost exclusively oriented towards repeating its current form into subsequent moments. The various gears are unaware of each other and unaware of the engine, as the thought form of the engine itself resides in human minds, but not within the constituents of the machine itself. As such, the mechanistic ontology of modern science is one which is fundamentally incapable of accounting for the inner reality of living things. What we are left with is a cold, dead, lifeless world. If such science is even willing to admit that consciousness exists at all, it is inevitably forced to conclude that consciousness is something which is fundamentally inaccessible to it. We are only ever able to access the outer manifestations of the world within our own consciousness, and the world in itself, therefore, remains forever beyond our grasp. Within an organic ontology, however, we can begin to see that the external, noumenal domain, the thing in itself which Kant believed we could never possibly encounter, is in fact the inner reality of other living beings. The way in which we make contact with this noumenal reality is not by meditating ourselves into some mystical state of altered consciousness, by ingesting copious amounts of hallucinogenic substances, or by devising absurdly convoluted mathematical models. Rather, we arrive at the inner reality of the world we inhabit precisely by taking our own direct, tangible experience of the world far more seriously than physicalistic science has ever been capable of. Through attending rigorously to that which we actually encounter empirically, we can then begin to synthesize the multiplicity of these phenomena into a holistic structure of relationships, which is in fact the psychical reality which underlies the external appearances. This psychical reality is not hidden from us in some transcendental realm which is forever beyond our reach. Rather, it is found within the manifest. As Jean Gebser tells us, this mode of perception is one in which the manifest world is effectively rendered transparent or diaphanous, as we come to see the inner unity which is present within the relationships between phenomena. There is nothing extra which is needed here. There is no mysterious code which we need to crack in order to reintegrate ourselves with the world. If we simply abandon the physicalistic dogmas which have throttled science for the past 500 years, then empiricism alone will carry us into the world of spirit. This is something which we can achieve in broad daylight with eyes wide open, sober as a judge. As we engage in this envisionary mode of perception, what we find is that the inner reality of other beings come to take shape within our own inner worlds. This process is what we might otherwise simply refer to as empathy. It is a mode of experience within which the inner worlds of two organisms come to be synchronized and synergized with one another, such that there is a shared reality of inner feelings. What this then implies is that empathy is not merely an emotional affect. Rather, empathy is in fact the most truly epistemological faculty of the human mind, that which brings us into direct contact with the noumenon. As we have already noted, the Platonic mystical tradition was already well aware of the formative aspects of reality, but within such mystical traditions we can see that the noetic faculty was seen as entirely passive and receptive. Experiences of the forms in themselves were achieved through a process of mystical initiation, such as that illustrated throughout the Socratic dialogues. Through such initiation, the forms can begin to be perceived through a kind of mystical insight, but the forms nonetheless are experienced as external to the human mind. Conversely, the envisionary consciousness illustrated by Goethe and others is one in which the faculty of noesis has come to be internalized into the human ego. We are able to perceive the world of psyche or spirit not through mystical experiences alone, but rather through what Goethe termed active seeing, an envisionary perception which is driven precisely by the creative and empathic power of the right cerebral hemisphere. This is a power to actively synthesize and thus recreate the psychical contents of the world within ourselves, and thus the power to empathically co-experience the inner reality of the organisms which constitute our living world. This then is the envisionary stage of human ego evolution. It is the sixth structure of consciousness, the seventh phase of creation, and the disclosure of the fifth dimension of reality. As we have seen over the course of this series, each structure of consciousness is correlated with the awakening of the human ego to a new form of dimensionality, a new way in which the contents of consciousness can be related to one another. With the archaic structure, we find zero-dimensional oneness. Within the magical structure, we find monodimensional resonance. Within the mythical structure, we find bidimensional polarity. Within the discursive structure, we find tridimensional dialectics, and within the perspectival structure, we find tetradimensional spatiality. Within the envisionary structure, what we encounter is the fifth dimension, which is none other than time. Time has been understood in many different ways throughout the history of metaphysics. Within ancient Greek thought, we find three distinct notions of time. Aeonic time is time in the sense of eternal cosmic cycles. Aeonic time is very much akin to Nietzsche's notion of eternal return and was traditionally associated with the wheel of the zodiac. Kairos time is time in the sense of opportune or decisive moments of action. Kairos is much like the crest of a wave composed of archetypal power. The sense of time which we are most familiar with in the modern world is Chronos time, associated with the planet Saturn. Fundamentally, Chronos time is the continuity or inertia of the past. It is time understood as a sequence in which past events determine the nature of subsequent events. It is the solid insistence of the determining influence of the past upon a present moment, a boulder rolling down a hill or dominoes knocking one another over in successive moments. As Cartesian dualism gave way to mechanistic materialism during the 19th and 20th centuries, all other understandings of time came to be erased, leaving only chronos time. This then resulted in a metaphysics of determinism, in which all of time was understood to be fully determined by past states. Taken to its logical conclusion, this implies that the entire history of the universe was effectively written in the original configuration of physical matter which was present at the beginning of time. All freedom, agency, and volition thus appear to be entirely illusory, as all existence is a slave to the determinacy of the past. With the emergence of envisionary consciousness, however, we can begin to perceive time as a living totality in a manner that was not even available to the ancients. We can begin to see time etiologically, as Jean Gebser puts it, time as a creative, originative power. Etiological time is time understood as a cyclic, quaternal process of concretion, anamnesis, discernment, and synthesis. Psychical forms densify into specific particular events within the corporeal world. These events are then incorporated as pictures into the pleroma, wherein they are hierarchically organized and synthesized so as to continually generate and regenerate the forms themselves. Those forms are then the psychical contents from which the bodily world is generated. This time is cyclical, not in the sense of eternal return, but rather in the sense of ongoing, self-determining, and co-creative processes. The archetypal morphology of etiological time is, of course, the toroidal field, which we see in the human brain, the tree of life, electromagnetic fields, and all forms of multicellular life. The basic morphology of the magical structure was the point, representing the underlying unity of resonance and synchronicity. For the mythical structure, we have the circle, representing the syzygy of opposites within a polar understanding of the world. Within the discursive structure, we have the triangle, representing emanation from the divine monad and the processes of mental, logical reasoning. The perspectival structure is then represented by the sphere, the surfaces which delineate the identities of discrete bodies and minds, as well as representing the basic structure of space. Within envisionary consciousness, this sphere comes to undergo gastrulation, thus becoming the torus of etiological time. The creative, imaginal power of the envisionary structure allows us to penetrate into the inner reality of the world and of other beings. It is a power of empathy, and it is the underlying engine which generates the world itself. However, simply understanding this capability is not enough. Our current moment of Earth evolution is one of tremendous significance and tremendous danger. In order to understand where we find ourselves now, we must be able to look at the modern world as a manifestation of an archetypal drama which is as ancient as the world itself. In the next video, we will begin by examining the most encompassing Eidolons, which are currently at play in the demolition of human civilization. Ahriman, Lucifer, Christ and Antichrist, Aquarius and Pluto, the Faustian spire, and the feathered serpent of the coming epoch. Thanks for watching.